Hi everybody, welcome back to Hooking A. In today's video I'm going to be showing you how to start working in the round, which is crocheting in a circle. I'm going to be showing you two different methods to get started, which is using a chain or using a magic loop, and talking to you about how to do your increases. I can see I've got two different circles here. They're both done using exactly the same stitches. It's just that the starting part was different. So this one I started with a chain, and this one I started with a magic loop. It doesn't really look much different from the back. Obviously these ends need to be sewn in, so you can see I've still got that nice closed ring in the middle, and then I've done a few more rows on this one, which is just what's made it bigger. So it's really personal preference which one you start with. As you'd be familiar of doing chains, I'm going to start with that for you before we move on to the magic loop. So I'm just going to start with my slip knot. And for this chain, it's only going to be 3 stitches long. It doesn't need to be a particularly long chain. The longer the chain is, the more likely you're going to end up with an open loop in the middle of your work, and you might not want that to actually be there. So I've just chained 3, and then I'm going to make a loop out of this by slip stitching into that first chain. So I'm just going underneath that first stitch here. You can go into the side of it if you prefer. Just always go into the back loop of my chains, and then just a slip stitch there. I'm just going to pull this end in a little bit, otherwise your stitch will separate and it'd be tricky to see where the centre of your loop is. If I just show you, use a stitch marker just to show you this here. This bit here is actually that first chain, that loop there, and this loop here is the centre of the circle that we've just made. So it's useful to have a stitch marker handy when you first start out doing this, or you can just use another strand of a different coloured yarn, a safety pin, a paper clip, anything like that. It doesn't have to be an expensive stitch marker. So now that I've made this ring, this is where we're going to be doing all of our stitches. I'm going to work this in trebles just because the stitches are larger, so it'd be easier for you to see. But it's exactly the same technique regardless of what stitch you're using, so you do the same for doubles or half trebles. So I'm just going to do my starting chain as if I were at the beginning of a row, and my first treble is going to go into the centre of that circle that we've made, just making sure I'm not going back into that stitch. There we go. It's a little bit more defined now that there's a stitch in there. You can see there's still just a little bit of a gap there where that first chain was, but I've not gone into that. So that's my first treble into the centre. Do second one. What I'm going to do for this, I think I'll do 10 trebles into that ring to start off with. Depending on what pattern you're following, it might be a different amount. It could be an odd number, that's fine, and that's going to determine how many stitches you're going to do on each row then. But it will always be an even number that you have on your second row, even if you start off with an odd number here, and I will explain that in a moment. So I'm just up to 4 trebles here and 5. So now that I've got halfway, I'm just going to show you how this is looking. So now you can see this sweet little fan shape. This hole in the middle is the loop from the chain. So down here, these are just the other chain stitches that we made at the beginning. So we're not going through those stitches, we're going over them completely, so they'll be completely covered when we get round there. And you'll notice I just keep going into that hole in the centre. You don't have to do anything different with your hands or with the yarn when you're working in a circle. It's exactly the same stitch formations as if you were working flat. So I'm just going to carry on doing those. That's 6, 7, I'm sorry if you can hear this yarn squeaking a little bit as well. Every now and again it just makes a little squeaky noise rubbing against the hook because it's acrylic. Now I've lost count because I started speaking. So we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 and 10. So once you've done the number of stitches that you want, we need to close this to make it a proper circle. So to do that, you find your first stitch. So for me, because when I work trebles, I do a chain 2 at the beginning and I don't count that as my first stitch. So this is my first stitch here. I'm just going to pop my hook into the top of that and slip stitch again like we did to begin the circle. There we go, and that's closed that circle up for me. I'm just going to pull this tight at the back as well, just to make sure that that first chain is closed up. And now you can see we've got a circle here and it's completely closed. So as when you're starting another row with working flat, we're going to have to do a chain to get the height up for the stitch that we need. You just don't turn for this one. With working in the round like this, you don't get a front, you don't get the front and the back and the front and the back of your stitches like you would if you're turning over each time. It's got a complete front and back, so you'll see that the stitches actually look quite different compared. I'll show you this one, it's a little bit larger. So this is the front of it, and you can see all the stitches are facing the same way. And then if I turn it over to the back, it actually looks quite different. It's not as noticeable with working flat when you turn over each time, because you get the overall texture. But if you're working just with the piece facing one direction, there is a noticeable difference to the front and the back of the stitches. So to do my next row, so I'm not turning here at all. I'm just going to do my chain, and then my first treble is going into that stitch where I did the slip stitch into. That's going to be the first stitch that we use. Now if I were to do just one treble in each stitch around, it's going to pull this down tight and start making a tubular shape. Because I want to keep working and keeping it flat like this, we're going to have to do an increase in each stitch. Now we've got one stitch in each around for the first round, so in this second one we're going to do 2 in each stitch around. So as I started with 10, I'm going to end up with 20. Even if you start with an odd number, because you're doing 2 in every stitch around for your second row, you will end up with an even number, just because that's how maths works. So it's helpful to know that the second one is all going to be in pairs, and then we're going to be increasing slightly differently on the next row and the next one, but the pattern of repeating remains the same regardless of how many stitches you've actually got. So I'm just going to quickly whiz around this. I'm doing 2 in every single stitch, so it's an increase in every stitch from the first round. And you'll see that this is quite quickly getting a lot bigger than that first circle. These do work up very, very quickly. So it's quite a satisfying thing to do, because you see what it grows quite quickly. Working circles, you can do garments that are worked in the round. There are blankets that are worked in the round. When you are crocheting in the round, you can make other shapes other than circles, which is something that we will look at in a future video. One of the very popular crochet patterns is the granny square, which is a square piece that's worked in the round, but it's very, very common. You'll recognise one when you see one. So this is a really nifty technique to know. For me, I probably use it most often for making hats. I make a lot of hats, and hats are one of the things that I used to make a lot when I used to crochet to sell my things at craft fairs. They were very, very popular, particularly children's hats. So we're nearly around to the beginning. Sorry if there was a jump in the video there, I did just have to pause it momentarily. So we can just go back round check, we've done 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. So I'm going to be closing this circle again just by going back into that first treble and doing a slip stitch. So there we go, and that's your second round completed. And then for your third one, you do exactly the same, where you would chain up. And again, because we're working flat, we would want to do increases, but if I just did 2 in every stitch around, again, we're going to end up with a tube going down like this, or we're going to end up with a very, very wobbly shape, and we want a nice even increase. So I'm going to show you on a couple of other pieces. For the third round, the increases that we do, instead of going 2, 2, 2, this time we do 1 treble, then 2, then 1, then 2, then 1, then 2, and so on all the way around. So your increase is in every other stitch to do that next row, and then it's closed off in exactly the same way, just a slip stitch into your beginning stitch, and then as you move on to do a 4th row, so you can see I've got first one, second one, the third one, and this time we're going to add in an extra single stitch on its own before the increase. So here, this is the first stitch here, we've gone 1, 2, increase, 1, 2, increase, 1, 2, increase, and so on all the way around. And then, as you've probably guessed, for the next row we would add in another single one. So this time we've gone 1, 2, 3, increase, 1, 2, 3, increase. And if you look closely, you'll notice that then each time you're doing your round, your increase is going to be, they're going to be above each other in that. So you can just see I've got an increase here, an increase there, and an increase there, and an increase there. Just those little V shapes there that give it away. So you continue in that pattern. So every time you go to a new row, you add 1 more in between your increases. And you'll notice, if you're sort of interested in numbers, it's one of the things that might pop out to you. In the second row, it's 2 in every stitch. And then in the third one, we go 1, 2, 3 for your increase. So third row, third stitch is where your increase is. 4th row, you're going 1, 2, 3 and 4. So your 4th stitch is where your increase is, and it goes on like that. It's very easy to tell if you've done the increase in the wrong place, because it will start to go a little bit wobbly and look wrong. And you can see that this is curling up slightly. That's completely normal. Usually when you get to the end of a piece, you would block it, which is a way of shaping it. That's something else that I'll show you in another video. So that's basically how you do increases, and that's exactly the same whether you start with a chain or with a magic loop. Obviously this first piece that we did, I did start that with a chain. So now I'm just going to quickly go through how you do a magic loop. This is a slightly different technique. It's the way that I prefer to do it, just because it's a little bit tighter in the middle, and it makes it easier for you to do those stitches in that first row, because it's an adjustable shape. Same as with your slip knot at the beginning, it's like an adjustable one, so you can loosen it out so you've got plenty of space to see what you're doing, and then pull it back in to make it nice and tight when you've finished. So I'm not actually going to be starting with a slip stitch here, a slip knot, sorry. We start with just the yarn itself on its own, don't even need my hook at the moment. And to make this magic ring, I'm going to hold the end of the yarn in one hand, stick my finger out in the other, and wrap it over from front to back, bring it up again and over, and I'm just going to hold that end in this hand. So you see now I've got these 2 loops on my finger. Now I'm going to take my hook and slide it under that first loop, and I'm just going to pull that second loop underneath, and then hook goes into that loop, and then very carefully just slide this off your finger and then pull this tail and chain one, and that is your magic loop. So you can see now, if I want to tighten this, just pull it here. If I want to make it looser, stretch it out, and you would just start working your chains and your stitches as normal, but this time you can see I've got my finger through the loop just to stop it from closing up, and I'm holding the end of the yarn in my hook hand here just to make sure that doesn't get pulled right through. Obviously you've got loads more space than you have with the chain on this, so you can really see what you're doing. It's also helpful if you happen to be making something that has quite a lot of stitches in that first row, that you've got plenty of space to start them in, and then you can tighten it right down when you've done as many as you need. So it would continue going like that, and then you can just pull this nice and tight to close it when you've got to the end. So I'm just going to show you that again. I've just pulled all those stitches back out. So starting with the end of the yarn in my right hand, and the working yarn over here to my left. Leave a nice long tail just so I've got plenty to play with as well, because we're going to be moving this around afterwards. It's better to have that tail be far too long than too short, as there's less chance that you're accidentally going to pull it all the way through. So holding this tail end, my finger out from the front, in front of my finger to the back, I'm going to go over. I'm going to come under it with this tail end, and then in the same motion over it again. I'm going to hold this end, take my crochet hook, slide it underneath, and then I'm just going to catch this other loop, pull it under like that. And very carefully, I'm just going to wiggle it off my finger, and then catch hold of this loop and chain just to close that off. And then, as I was saying, we treat this the same as we did that chain we did for the first one, but this time we're working the stitches into this huge great big loop, so we've got lots and lots of space. And you do as many of these as you needed to, whatever your pattern says. And then once you've done as many stitches as you need, I'll just do a couple more. I'm not really counting how many I'm doing here, as I'm not going to carry on actually making something out of this. So once you've got your required number of stitches, you'll see I'm just holding that end still in those fingers. And then, so that you can get all the way back across, just going to pull this end, and you'll see this will close the circle up. And then if we're going to continue this, once I've closed that up, I can then bring this end across and do my slip stitch there. And there we go. So that's how you do the magic ring. As I said, that's my preferred technique, but it doesn't matter. You can do it whichever way you prefer. If you're more familiar with chains and that's easier for you, by all means do a chain. If you were working a lot more stitches than the 10 that I did in the one that I showed you, you could just do 4 chains or even 5 instead. The only difference is if you don't fill that entirely, you will end up with a bit of a ring in the middle. I'm just going to show you here just by trying to loosen this magic loop. And sometimes you might want that. That can be part of the aesthetic, especially if you're making like an applique or something. Flowers, sometimes you leave that loose. You can sort of put beads or that kind of thing in there, or you might just want to leave it open. So you've got plenty of choice, and it depends on what you're actually making. Flowers is another thing that I'll probably show you at some point. They're very quite easy to make once you can work in the round, and very satisfying, and you can do all sorts with them. And then as an aside, if you do follow that and manage to do a couple of rounds, something like this here, you've made something again. Simple flat circles like this, you can use it as a drinks coaster. So there's my coffee nicely on that. And there we go. So you don't need a huge amount of techniques just to actually be able to produce things. So now that I've shown you working in the round, what I'm going to show you in the next video, slightly more advanced, but nothing particularly difficult if you've managed to follow and keep up with me so far. I'm going to show you how to add in another strand of yarn. So this is going to be if you are working on something and you run out of yarn, you get to the end of the ball of yarn and you need to use more, how to join that in. And also if you are doing colour changes, how to drop the yarn that you're working with and change to a different colour, and so on. It's exactly the same technique for both, and it's quite nice. And once you can start working in different colours, you can really get going with coming up with some of your own patterns or following some that you found online or in magazines. So thanks for joining me again today, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.